The United States is calling on Israel to rethink a full-scale incursion into Rafah. The State Department says Israel's military operations are undermining both its global reputation and the ceasefire talks.
We think that a Rafah operation would weaken Israel's position both in these talks and writ large. We've talked about this before, that a major military operation in Rafah would further weaken Israel's standing in the world, would further create distance from its partners in the region who actually share Israel's goal of seeing Hamas defeated and want to see Hamas replaced with a different governance structure in Gaza.
Meanwhile, reaction has been swift to Joe Biden saying that he will stop sending some weapons to Israel if it launches a full assault into Rafah. He's now coming under fire from politicians at home and in Israel. Chris Brown has that.
In Rafah, an awful new phase of the war in Gaza may be at hand, with these overnight missile strikes part of the opening salvos. The weariness on young Mohammed Khalil Abu Khanes's face captured the horror he'd experienced. My friends, they died, he said. We were gathering their body parts and pieces. Israel is facing immense international pressure to stop and not send ground troops into Rafah to attack Hamas militants. The city is crowded with more than 1 million people and is already facing cascading crises from a shortage of food, fuel, and housing. But in a video released Thursday night, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu struck a defiant tone. If we need to stand alone, we will stand alone. We will fight with our fingernails, he said in an apparent rebuke to U.S. President Joe Biden, who cut off some shipments of large bombs to Israel and who said he'd stop more if Israel went ahead with the major operation in Rafah.
I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem.
Everybody now understands the depth of the rift between Israel and the U.S.
Iran Etzion, a former security advisor to Israeli governments, said Israel's military can make do without the weapon shipments for now, but Biden's public rebuke is unprecedented.
And what the Americans are trying to do is to demonstrate to the Israeli public their government is not representing their interests, and their government is actually working against their interests.
But any hope the U.S. action might provoke a sudden change of Israeli strategy quickly faded as negotiators left Cairo without a deal to free Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners and suspend the fighting. Hundreds of hostage families and their supporters protested in Tel Aviv, calling for their release. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, meanwhile, is precarious. Israel released video of what it said was aid moving again through one of the 2 border crossings it had closed earlier in the week. But in Gaza, aid officials say almost nothing is getting through, and at best, Rafah has a day or 2 of food and fuel left. Chris Brown, CBC News, Jerusalem.
For more on the impact that Biden's comments are having, I'm now joined by Aaron David Miller. He's a former U.S. State Department Middle East negotiator and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He joins me now from Washington. Mr. Miller, it's great to be able to speak with you tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you, what do you make of this, I think we can call it a new tone that's coming from President Biden, this tone that he is now striking with Netanyahu?
Oh, look, I think it's significant, but I remind your viewers and listeners for the context here. The administration has made a decision to pause, and I suspect the Israelis will ultimately get these high-value munitions, to pause one shipment against the backdrop of a $14 billion congressional appropriation, part of a big package for Ukraine and Taiwan that passed several weeks ago. And on the front end, the administration is just moving forward with $780 million in munitions and offensive weaponry for the Israelis. So I think you've got to read this and take it for what it's worth, which is, I think, a deep unhappiness on the part of the president that the Israelis are contemplating a massive ground campaign in Rafah, which he believes, quite correctly, given the fact that Hamas's 4 battalions are co-located in deep within Rafah city proper, co-located in and around civilian structures and populations would result in an exponential rise in Palestinian deaths and an intensification of the humanitarian catastrophe that exists in Gaza now. And I think it's a fair point. The downside, of course, is that it'll send an unmistakable signal to Hamas that, in fact, they don't have much to worry about with respect to an Israeli offensive, and might also convince them to toughen up their position during the negotiations that have been occurring over the last week or so in Cairo.
Aaron, let me ask you, I mean, we're 7 months now into this war. We have heard, in varying degrees of sternness from the U.S. president, calling on Israel to take more care when it comes to civilian lives in Gaza. Why do you think that he has had a very hard time getting that message through, and only now at this point are we noticing a shift in tone? Why is he taking this hard line now? Why wouldn't he have done something like this a little sooner?
Well, he has pressed earlier on issues like humanitarian access with some success. He's got a few crossings to be opened, and he also has pressed the Israelis with the threat of changing his policy if they didn't help facilitate more assistance into Gaza. I think that Rafah represents a sort of microcosm, everything that makes the Israeli-Hamas war so complex. And I think it's a realistic assessment on the part of the administration that if the Israelis go ahead and do a major ground campaign, then prospects are freeing the hostages, prospects for de-escalating military activity, prospects for any sort of ceasefire, and no space will exist for the president's regional initiative that they'd very much like to do, assuming they got a ceasefire. So I think there are many different elements. And I also believe that domestic politics is clearly a part of this as well. You've got progressive Democrats and mainstream Democrats pressing the president to be tougher with Israel. But as we've seen, you also now have Republicans, including the Senate minority leader, Mitch McConnell, basically accusing the administration of betrayal. So Biden's navigating a course which is increasingly fraught, it seems to me. There are upsides and downsides of the actions that he's taken.
Right, and perhaps that's why he has walked a careful line here, as you say. Do you think, what's the chances that he's going to withhold more weapons, that this is going to be a tactic we will see him discuss more?
I think it really depends on whether or not the Israelis will operate in Rafah below the level at which they would cross the president's red line, or whether they're openly prepared to flaunt the president's advice and his warning and go ahead with the ground campaign anyway. But let's be clear about something. With 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah City, it would take the Israelis weeks. This is not a 2-week operation. We're talking about a major ground campaign here, which would last multiple weeks. I'm not entirely persuaded that the War Cabinet at this stage wants to undertake such a massive ground campaign. But we'll see. Nobody can predict this. And Mr. Netanyahu's bravado, we can go it alone. I mean, isn't it strange how things have changed? In response to 350 high-trajectory weapons launched by Iran on April 13-14, you had, for the first time ever, not just U.S. support of Israeli combat operations to turn those weapons back. You had the French, you had the British, and you had the willing participation of key Arab states, including Jordan, publicly acknowledged the fact that they shot down over their airspace Iranian pilotless drones, but also the participation of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the Emirates, who did not obviously want to draw attention to their role. So Israel has a certain dependence on the United States, and I think that's clear to everyone, even the Israeli Prime Minister, who may want to pretend that there is no dependency.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time tonight. Aaron David Miller
You're
is
welcome.
a former...
Thanks for having me.
Aaron David Miller, former Middle East negotiator with the U.S. State Department.